May 1940. Picture this. If you were a soldier in the French army, you're probably standing guard somewhere along this massive defensive line, the strongest the world had ever seen. Or maybe you're positioned up in Belgium, just waiting for history to repeat itself.
Yeah, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Because 70 years before, almost to the day, this little riverside town, Sedan, it wasn't just any town. It was where modern Germany was essentially forged, where the last French emperor, Napoleon III, was captured. Huge historical weight.
Absolutely. And now, May 1940, the stakes feel even bigger. They feel global. The future of Western Europe is literally hanging in the balance. And, everyone is bracing for a long, grinding war like the last one.
But, well, history rarely gives you a straight rerun, does it? What actually unfolds over the next 6 weeks just blows all those pre-war predictions completely out of the water.
The collapse of France. It's just so swift.
Total.
And frankly, shocking to everyone at the time, and maybe even looking back now.
It really is. So what we want to do today is a proper deep dive. We're digging into the sources, the accounts, the analyses, trying to uncover the real anatomy of this failure. Was this defeat, this incredibly rapid defeat, was it just inevitable? Was it down to, unstoppable German innovation, some kind of military genius?
Yeah, was it something else? Was it really about fatal French shortcomings, systemic problems, maybe incompetence deep within the system, or, as some sources hint, maybe something, let's say, far more troubling right at the top of the command chain?
That's the core question. Our mission here is to really understand these two, totally incompatible ways of thinking about war that just smashed into each other in 1940.
You've got France betting everything on time, defense, digging in. Their whole strategy is just steeped in the trauma, the absolute horror of World War I.
And then you have Germany. Germany's operating like a predator, almost. It's very survival, economically and politically, depends entirely on winning fast. A swift, total victory. They called it Bewegungskrieg. War of movement. And it wasn't just military theory. It was driven by this urgent, almost desperate economic pressure cooker they were in.
And the whole thing is set up for this catastrophic collision because of, one single, just staggering miscalculation.
Yeah.
It comes down to timing.
It really does. The French general staff, they sat down, they looked at the maps, the terrain, the Ardennes forest, right? Rugged, dense, narrow roads. They figured, okay, it's going to take the Germans, realistically, somewhere between 7, maybe even up to 15 days to push through that terrain and then get across the Meuse River.
7 to 15 days. That's their window.
That's the buffer they thought they had.
They did it in 3.5.
3.5 days.
Yeah.
It's almost unbelievable.
It's faster than you could probably drive it today if you hit traffic.
Yeah.
So, let's unpack how on earth that was even possible. Okay, so let's start peeling back the layers on the French side. What led them to put all their eggs in this defensive basket? You mentioned the trauma of 1914-18. It wasn't just like a bad memory, right? It was an open wound for the whole nation.
Oh, completely. You have to understand, the fighting, almost all of it on the Western Front, happened on French soil. It devastated their industrial heartland in the Northeast. Towns, villages wiped off the map.
And the human cost.
The human cost was staggering. France lost 6% of its entire male population. 6%. Think about it. That's a whole generation just gone, annihilated. When a country goes through that kind of demographic bleeding, the lesson seems crystal clear.
Never again.
Never again let yourselves get drawn into this head-on slugfest, this open battle of attrition where you just trade lives for yards of mud. Defense wasn't seen as, cowardly or passive. It was seen as the only sane, the only prudent way to preserve what little demographic strength the nation had left, especially when you looked across the Rhine and saw Germany rearming at breakneck speed with a much larger population to draw soldiers from.
So this fear, this collective national scar, it literally takes concrete form. The Maginot Line.
Exactly. And it's important to note this wasn't some panic reaction after Hitler came to power in 1933. The planning started way back, mid-1920s. Serious analysis, debate. Construction really kicked off in earnest around 1928, 1929. And the scale of this thing is hard to comprehend even today.
We're not just talking about trenches, are we?
Oh, no. Think of it more like a subterranean fortress city embedded deep into the earth. We're talking huge reinforced concrete casemates, gun turrets, observation posts, all sunk into hillsides, often interconnected by kilometers of underground tunnels.
Tunnels big enough for what? Barracks.
Barracks, hospitals, command centers, ammunition storage, kitchens. Even narrow-gauge electric railways running underground to shuttle supplies and shells from one point to another. It was this incredible feat of engineering designed to just soak up any conceivable attack.
And the price tag for this concrete shield.
Immense. The sources point to around 5 billion francs by the mid-1930s. Now, that sounds like a lot, and it ate up something like 7.5% of the entire French army budget each year between 28 and 36.
Wow.
But, look, from their perspective, it wasn't just about stopping shells. The cost had a very specific threefold doctrinal purpose. First, obviously, hold the frontier, but do it with minimal manpower tied down in static positions.
Bring up the main army.
Exactly. Second, conserve the bulk of the French field army, giving them crucial time for full mobilization if war came. Time to get all the reserves called up, equipped, moved into position.
And third, it was kind of like a giant strategic funnel, wasn't it? By making that eastern border with Germany basically impregnable.
You're essentially telling the Germans where they have to attack, or at least where the French high command believed they had to attack. General Maurice Gamelin, the commander-in-chief, and others, they were convinced they were channeling the main German effort.
Forcing them
North into Belgium, just like the Schlieffen Plan back in 1914. That was the assumption. If the Maginot Line held the direct border secure, then France could confidently send its best mobile armies, the 1st, the 7th, the 9th, swinging up into Belgium and the Netherlands. They'd meet the Germans there, on ground they'd chosen, hopefully with strong British and Belgian support alongside them.
But here's the rub, right?
Yeah.
The sources really emphasize that this defensive doctrine, this Maginot mindset, it became rigid, almost fossilized. The leadership, guys like Daladier, the prime minister, and Cavellin himself, they seemed psychologically locked into this view, even as the 1930s wore on.
Yeah, they seem to have completely missed, or maybe willfully ignored, the huge doctrinal shifts and, critically, the technological leaps the Germans were making, particularly with tanks and aircraft coordination. They were essentially preparing to refight the last war using a World War I lesson plan against a rapidly evolving World War II enemy.
And this military rigidity, it dovetailed perfectly with this wider economic strategy they had. France wasn't just planning a military defense, they were thinking economically too. They planned a blockade, essentially aiming to wait out Hitler's Germany. Wait out what some historians later call the shark economy.
That's a great term for it, the shark economy.
Tell us more about that. What made Germany's economy like a shark?
Well, Hitler's economic recovery after 1933, it looked impressive from the outside, but underneath it was built on incredibly shaky foundations. It was a masterful act of, frankly, financial deception. He desperately needed to rearm, but he couldn't risk political instability by, say, raising taxes significantly or defaulting on Germany's existing international debts.
So how did they pay for all those tanks and planes?
Through smoke and mirrors, basically. Creative accounting that was ultimately ruinous. The most famous or infamous mechanism was something called the MEFO bills.
Ah, yes, the promissory notes, the IOUs.
Yes.
Issued through a shell company.
Exactly. MEFO, Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft. Sounds like a boring metal research company, right? But it was a dummy corporation set up by the state. Factories building tanks, planes, guns, all the military hardware. They weren't getting paid in actual Reichsmarks. They were getting paid in these MEFO bills, essentially IOUs from this dummy company, which the German state vaguely promised to redeem in 5 years with interest.
So it kept the spending off the official government books.
Precisely. It was crucial because it hid the true astronomical scale of military spending from both the German public, who might have balked at the cost, and importantly, from international observers and creditors. It looked like a managed recovery, but underneath.
It was this massive internal pyramid scheme. The government was funding today's tanks with promises about tomorrow's money.
You got it. A huge pile of IOUs building up within the German financial system. But here's the catch. Those redemption deadlines, the 5-year clock on those MEFO bills, they were ticking. By the late 1930s, those bills were starting to loom large, threatening to come due.
And Germany didn't have the cash.
They were starved for hard currency dollars, pounds, gold. They couldn't easily get big international loans anymore. So their economy, just like a shark, had only one way to survive. It had to keep moving forward and consuming. External plunder became essential.
So the annexations, Austria, Czechoslovakia, they weren't just about Lebensraum or politics.
They were absolutely financial injections as well, necessary feeding frenzies for the shark. Annexing Austria in 38 gave the Nazi regime access to the Austrian National Bank's gold reserves and hard currency. It staved off a potential crisis. Taking Czechoslovakia in 39 brought in more resources, more industrial capacity.
But it wasn't enough to stop the clock.
No, by 1939, the pressure was immense. The Reich absolutely, fundamentally could not afford a long war. It needed a short, sharp, victorious campaign, a Blitzkrieg, to seize the resources of Poland and then potentially France and others faster than its own internal debts crushed it. If the war dragged on past, say, 6 months, maybe 9 months, the German economy risked imploding under the weight of those MEFO bills and other financial strains.
Okay, so now the French strategy makes perfect sense. The Maginot Line wasn't just a wall, it was a timer.
Exactly. The perceived genius of the French approach was deny Germany that quick victory it desperately needed, use the Maginot Line to force a stalemate on the direct border, use the alliance's naval power to impose a blockade, cut off resources, and just wait. Prolong the struggle. Let Germany's fragile shark economy chew itself up from the inside until the Mefo bill pyramid collapsed. Victory wouldn't necessarily be won by glorious battle, but by financial attrition, by simply outlasting the enemy.
But for that entire strategy to work, you needed that initial delay. You absolutely had to gain time.
You had to buy time, and at Sedan, they didn't just fail to buy time. They lost all the time they thought they had, and then some.
All right, so France is betting on time and defense. What's the German answer? You mentioned Bewegungskrieg.
Right, the war of movement. This wasn't some new idea cooked up by the Nazis. It has deep roots in Prussian and later German military thinking going back centuries. Prussia, historically, was often smaller, less populated than its big neighbors, France, Russia, Austria. It couldn't afford to get bogged down in long, grinding wars of attrition like World War I. Survival depended on winning quickly, decisively.
Lightning strikes.
Exactly. The mantra became Kurz and Vivas, short and lively. Keep things moving. The core principles were about concentrating your force, finding the enemy's weak spot, the Schwerpunkt, the center of gravity or point of main effort punching through it, and then using speed and maneuver to get behind them and encircle their main army. The classic Kesselschlacht, the cauldron battle. Trap them, destroy them, war over quickly.
So, after the absolute horror and stalemate of the Western Front in World War I, how did the Germans adapt this idea?
Well, the leadership of the post-war German army, the tiny 100,000-man Reichswehr allowed by Versailles, they looked very hard at the lessons, particularly a guy named Hans von Seeckt, the chief of staff. He didn't look just at the Western Front trench warfare. He looked closely at the Eastern Front against Russia, which was much more fluid, much more about maneuver over vast distances.
Where positional warfare hadn't really worked.
Right. Von Seeckt and others concluded that Germany's only hope in any future conflict was to fully embrace fast, mobile warfare, avoid getting stuck in trenches at all costs. And the key tool for this was obviously going to be the tank.
And this is where we see that huge split in thinking, right? The sources really highlight how the Allies, Britain and France, were kind of arguing amongst themselves about what tanks were even for.
They really were. Was it basically mobile artillery designed to slowly crawl alongside infantry and bus bunkers? That was a strong current in French thinking, leading to tanks like the heavy Sherby 1, powerful, heavily armored but relatively slow, designed almost for siege warfare. Or were tanks fast cavalry, meant for reconnaissance and raiding, like the British cruiser tank concept. They split their efforts, designing different tanks for different, often incompatible roles, and crucially, they tended to think of tanks as supporting the infantry, often parceling them out in small groups.
While the Germans,
particularly pushed by theorists and practitioners like Heinz Guderian, basically sidestepped that whole debate. Their revolutionary insight wasn't just about the tank itself, but about the formation built around the tank. The Panzer Division wasn't just a collection of tanks, it was designed from the ground up as a self-sufficient combined arms ecosystem built for speed and penetration.
Okay, break that down. What does combined arms mean in a 1940 Panzer Division?
It means balance. You didn't just have tanks. A typical Panzer Division in 1940 would have, say, 3 or 4 tank battalions. But crucially, it would be matched by an almost equal number 3 or 4 battalions of motorized infantry. Infantry riding in trucks or half-tracks, able to keep up with the tanks.
So the infantry wasn't left trudging miles behind.
Not at all. Plus, you had motorized reconnaissance units, often on motorcycles or in armored cars, scouting ahead. You had motorized engineers, vital for bridging rivers or clearing obstacles. You had dedicated anti-aircraft guns traveling with the column, mobile artillery, signal units, supply trucks, everything needed to sustain the advance, and everything capable of moving at roughly the same pace. The idea was, tanks break the line, seize the ground, but the motorized infantry is right there, immediately behind or alongside, to consolidate the gains, hold the flanks, suppress enemy anti-tank guns, and fight in built-up areas where tanks are vulnerable.
And how did that compare to, say, the French armored divisions, the DCRs?
The Division Cuirassé de Reserve, the Armored Reserve Division, was often, on paper, very powerful in terms of tank numbers and armor thickness. Some French tanks, like that Char B1, were individually superior to most German panzers in a head-to-head fight. But the DCRs were often unbalanced. Critically, they lacked sufficient organic motorized infantry to support and protect those powerful tanks.
So lots of hitting power, but vulnerable.
Very vulnerable, especially on the flanks or once they had to stop or slow down. They were conceived more as heavy breakthrough forces for set-piece battles or as mobile reserves to plug gaps, kind of like old-style cavalry. They weren't really designed or equipped for independent, deep, relentless penetration missions in the way the panzer divisions were.
Okay, doctrine, combined arms. But you mentioned technology earlier. What was the single biggest technical advantage the Germans had?
Radios. It sounds simple, maybe even boring, but it was absolutely fundamental. It was the central nervous system that made the whole Blitzkrieg concept work.
How widespread were radios in German tanks?
Virtually ubiquitous, at least for command tanks. Every German tank, right down to the platoon level, had at least a receiver. Platoon leaders, company commanders, battalion commanders, their tanks had both receivers and transmitters.
Allowing them to talk to each other.
Instantly. Imagine the flexibility this gives you. A company commander sees an opportunity on the flank. He can immediately redirect his platoons via radio. Air support spots a concentration of enemy anti-tank guns. They can radio the coordinates directly to the tanks below. Higher command wants to change the axis of advance. New orders go out over the airwaves in minutes. It allows for real-time coordination, rapid adaptation to changing situations, and keeps everyone roughly on the same page.
In the French tanks.
It was a completely different world.
Yeah.
Any French tanks, even some of the most powerful ones like the Smua S-35 or the Char B1, either had no radio at all or perhaps just a receiver. Very few had transmitters. Communication between tanks often relied on, well, signal flags, hand gestures, maybe runners if they stopped, field telephones if they were static for a long time. Basically, World War I technology.
Flags versus radio. It's no contest.
It's like trying to run a modern company using messenger pigeons versus email and smartphones, and it gets worse. In many French tanks, particularly the Char B1, the tank commander was also responsible for loading the main gun.
Seriously, the commander is loading shells.
Yes. So in the heat of battle, the guy who's supposed to be observing, commanding, making tactical decisions is pulled away from that vital task to physically handle ammunition. It's just an incredibly inefficient design from a command perspective.
So the Germans have this doctrinal focus on speed and combined arms, and they have the radio technology to actually coordinate it in real time.
Exactly. And that technological advantage allowed their officer corps to fully embrace a command philosophy known as mission command, or Auftragstaktik.
Explain that. How did it work?
The basic idea is decentralization. Higher headquarters sets the overall objective, the Auftrag. Something like, capture that bridge by nightfall, or advance 50 kilometers towards this town. But how the subordinate commander achieves that objective, that's largely left up to them. They're given the goal, the resources, and the freedom to figure out the best way to get it done based on the situation they encounter on the ground.
Instead of waiting for detailed step-by-step instructions from miles away.
Precisely. It fosters initiative, aggression, flexibility. If a German junior officer saw an unexpected opportunity, they didn't have to stop, try to get confirmation over a crackly phone line that might take hours. They were expected to seize the initiative, exploit the situation, and push forward aggressively towards the overall goal. It's perfect for the kind of fast-moving, chaotic environment of armored warfare.
And this kind of officer didn't just appear out of nowhere.
No, this goes back to von Ziegtegen and his reforms of the tiny Reichswehr in the 1920s. Because the army was limited to 100,000 men by the Treaty of Versailles, von Ziegt focused ruthlessly on quality over quantity. He aimed to create what he called a Führerheer, an army of leaders.
How did you do that?
Through incredibly rigorous selection standards and intense training, Every soldier, even down to the NCO level, was trained to potentially perform the duties of the rank above them. Every officer was expected to be capable of commanding the next higher formation. So when Germany finally threw off the shackles of Versailles and started rapidly expanding the army in the mid-30s, they had this highly trained professional cadre ready to step into leadership roles in the new panzer and motorized divisions. These were the guys steeped in Auftragstaktik, ready to take risks and lead from the front.
Wow. Okay, so you have the doctrine, the combined arms structure, the radio communication, and the trained aggressive leadership style. It's a potent mix.
It's a system perfectly designed for rapid exploitation, and the French strategy relying on slow mobilization, set-piece counterattacks, and holding a line. Well, if that initial line could be breached quickly, before the French system could react, it was potentially facing disaster.
So the Germans have this potentially devastating weapon in the panzer divisions. Now, how did they plan to use it against France? Let's talk about the actual plan, Fall Gelb, Case Yellow.
Right. And it's crucial to understand that the plan the Germans eventually used was not the original plan. The initial version, developed mostly during the autumn and winter of 1939, was much more cautious, much more traditional. It was largely the brainchild of the Army Chief of Staff, General Franz Halder.
What did Halder's plan look like?
It was basically a rerun of the old Schlieffen plan from 1914, but arguably less ambitious. The main German weight, including most of the panzer divisions, would smash into northern Belgium and the Netherlands. The goal was to defeat the Allied armies there, seize the Channel ports, maybe secure air bases to attack Britain.
But it meant attacking exactly where the Allies expected it and where their strongest forces were deploying.
Precisely. It was predictable. It would likely lead to a head-on collision with the best French and British divisions moving into Belgium. It almost guaranteed a slow, grinding battle of attrition in the mud and canals, exactly the kind of long war that Hitler knew Germany's shark economy couldn't sustain. Halder himself and many senior generals were actually quite skeptical about whether the panzers could achieve a decisive breakthrough against prepared Western defenses.
So this initial plan was underwhelming. It didn't really leverage Germany's unique strengths.
It was seen by some as a massive waste of Germany's potential kinetic advantage. It might gain some territory, maybe knock Holland and Belgium out of the war, but it probably wouldn't lead to a decisive encirclement of the main Allied force. And it put the German economy on a path towards serious trouble if the fighting dragged on. This led to a lot of internal debate, a lot of friction within the German high command throughout that phony war winter of 1939-1940.
And a key point of debate was the Ardennes, right? Could tanks even get through there effectively?
That was the million-dollar question. The Ardennes forest region is hilly, densely wooded, with narrow, winding roads. The critics argued it was completely unsuitable for large armored formations. They predicted massive traffic jams, logistical chaos. The entire advance could get hopelessly bogged down, becoming a sitting duck for Allied bombers attacking those choked roads. It seemed incredibly risky.
But not everyone agreed.
No. Two key figures in particular pushed back hard. One was Heinz Guderian, the Panzer visionary. He had actually fought in the Ardennes in 1914 as a young officer, and he argued that the very difficulty of the terrain made it the perfect place for a surprise attack, precisely because the French considered it impassable for tanks and had left it relatively weakly defended.
Attack where they least expect it.
The classic principle of war. The other key figure was General Erich von Manstein. At the time, he was serving as Chief of Staff to Gerd von Rundstedt, the commander of Army Group A, which was positioned opposite the Ardennes. Manstein looked at Halder's plan and thought it was strategically bankrupt. Working with Rundstedt, he developed a truly audacious alternative.
The Manstein plan, the famous Sickelschnitt, the sickle cut.
Exactly. The logic was brilliant in its simplicity and daring. Instead of hitting the Allies head-on in the north, you make a strong feint in that direction to draw the best Allied mobile forces deep into Belgium, just as they expected. But the real hammer blow, the Schwerpunkt, would come through the center, through the supposedly impassable Ardennes.
Punch through the weak spot.
Punch through the Ardennes, across the Meuse River quickly, crucially, around Sedan, and then, instead of turning south, wheel sharply right, driving westwards, straight for the English Channel coast.
Cutting off the armies in Belgium.
completely cutting off the entire Northern Allied Army group, the best French divisions, the British Expeditionary Force, the Belgians trapping them in a gigantic kessel, a cauldron, with their backs to the sea. It was the ultimate expression of Bewegungskrieg, maximum risk, maximum reward.
But this was radical. Did the High Command buy it immediately?
Not at all. Halder and the Army High Command, OKH, were resistant. It seemed far too risky, too dependent on everything going perfectly. The debate simmered, got quite heated, actually, through late 1939 and into early 1940. It might have remained just a theoretical proposal, but then chance intervened.
The Mechelin incident.
Yes, in January 1940, a German Luftwaffe staff officer carrying top-secret documents outlining the original cautious version of Fall Gelb got lost in fog and crash-landed his plane in Belgium. The Belgians captured the documents. Panic in Berlin. They had to assume their main offensive plan was now compromised, known to the Allies.
Suddenly they needed a new plan.
Urgently. They desperately needed a bold alternative, and this finally gave Manstein his opening. He managed, through various channels, to get his ideas directly to Hitler in February 1940.
And Hitler.
Hitler, who often distrusted the traditional Prussian generals and always had a penchant for dramatic, high-risk, high-reward strategies, was apparently immediately captivated. He loved the sheer audacity, the operational elegance of the Manstein proposal. He basically overruled the cautious generals and ordered that Fall Gelb be completely rewritten around the Ardennes thrust.
So the gamble was on. How did they organize the forces for this sickle cut?
This led to the creation of a new, powerful, and largely independent armored formation specifically designed for this deep penetration role, Panzergruppe Kleist. It was commanded by General Ewald von Kleist, and it was really a striking example of the new German way of war put into practice.
Give us a sense of the power concentrated in Kleist's command.
It was enormous. Kleist had under his direct command 5 full panzer divisions and 3 motorized infantry divisions. Think about that, 5 of Germany's 10 operational panzer divisions at the time, plus the fast-moving infantry to support them. That's something like 1,200 tanks, maybe more. Over half of Germany's entire frontline armor concentrated on this one narrow front, plus hundreds of armored cars, motorcycle troops, dedicated engineers, mobile artillery, anti-aircraft units, all designed to operate potentially days ahead of the main, slower-moving infantry armies following behind.
A self-contained armored fist.
Exactly. And leading the very tip of this spearhead was Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps, comprising 3 crucial divisions, the 1st Panzer, the 2nd Panzer, and the 10th Panzer. They were tasked with breaking through the Ardennes offenses and securing the Meuse crossings at Sedan.
And on May 10th, 1940, they launched. You mentioned the astonishing speed, 3.5 days to the Meuse. How did they actually manage the physical challenges of moving that much hardware through the Ardennes so fast?
It was a combination of factors. First, meticulous, incredibly detailed logistical planning. They didn't just use one road. They planned to use multiple parallel routes, even to tiny country lanes, assigning specific divisions to specific axes of advance to minimize bottlenecks, though traffic jams were still immense. The logistics plan ruthlessly prioritized getting fuel and ammunition to the leading panzer divisions, often at the expense of the motorized infantry following, let alone the foot-slogging infantry divisions further back.
Get the tanks forward at all costs.
At all costs. Second, there was the human element, pushed to the absolute limit. We now know that the relentless pace, driving day and night with minimal rest, was significantly aided by the widespread distribution of Pervitin.
The methamphetamine.
Yes, it kept exhausted tank crews, drivers, commanders awake, alert, and focused for days on end, pushing through fatigue barriers that would normally have stopped them. It literally fueled the speed of the advance.
So meticulous planning, plus amphetamines, plus that off-drug tactic you mentioned.
Exactly. That initiative-driven command style thrived in the chaos. When lead elements ran into resistance, local commanders didn't necessarily wait for orders. They quickly threw together small, ad hoc battle groups, Kampfgruppen, maybe a few tanks, some engineers on half-track, some motorcycle infantry to tackle the problem immediately. Seize that critical bridge before the enemy could blow it, bypass that pocket of resistance, keep the momentum going.
And the initial defenses in the Ardennes themselves. Belgian light infantry, French cavalry.
They were quickly overwhelmed or bypassed. The Belgian chasseurs Ardennais, brave light infantry fighting in their home territory, put up resistance but were simply too few and too lightly equipped to stop panzer divisions. The French had sent forward some light cavalry divisions, DLCs, equipped with armored cars and light tanks, mainly for reconnaissance and delay, but they were brushed aside by the sheer weight and speed of the German advance.
What about natural obstacles like rivers? There's the Semois River near Bouillon, right before Sedan.
That was a potential choke point. Bouillon was defended by a French garrison. But the speed and perceived strength of the German columns heading towards them, combined with lack of support and possibly shaky morale, led the French command to order a withdrawal from Bouillon during the night of May 11th.
They just gave it up.
They pulled back, allowing the Germans, specifically Guderian's corps, to quickly secure crossings over the Semois and establish forward supply dumps. It was another critical delay avoided. And so, by the evening of May 12th, early May 13th, Guderian's leading tanks were closing in on the final major obstacle, the Meuse River, right at Sedan. They were there a full day and a half, maybe even 2 days, ahead of the French High Command's most pessimistic timeline. The shield hadn't just been dented, it had been shattered before the French reserves were even fully in place to react.
Okay, so Guderian reaches the Meuse at Sedan on May 13th. Now, the post-war narrative, especially maybe in France for a while, sometimes painted Sedan as just this undefended gap in the Maginot Line, making the German crossing seem almost easy, inevitable. But you're saying the sources show that's not quite right.
No, it's really a misleading simplification. It kind of serves as a convenient excuse, masking the real operational failures that happened. While it's true the massive, deeply buried fortresses, the ouvrages of the main Maginot Line, were further south and east, the Sedan sector wasn't just empty fields.
It had defenses.
It did. They'd been constructed in the late 1930s as an extension, albeit a less formidable one, of the main line. We're talking about a network of concrete blockhouses, machine gun casemates, observation posts, some anti-tank gun emplacements, pillboxes stretching along the Meuse. They were functional defensive structures, definitely intended to resist an attack. Not impregnable like the main line, but certainly not nothing.
And the terrain itself, shouldn't that have heavily favored the defenders?
Absolutely. The Meuse River at Sedan is pretty wide, maybe 60 meters or so, and it flows through quite a deep valley. The southern bank, the French side, generally slopes upwards quite steeply from the river. This should have given the French defenders a significant elevation advantage. Excellent observation, and clear fields of fire down onto the riverbanks and the likely crossing points. It's naturally strong defensive ground.
So who was manning these defenses?
This is a critical point. The sector was held by French Territorial Reserve divisions, specifically the 55th and later the 71st Infantry Divisions. These were Category B divisions, meaning older reservists, often from the local area, less training, less modern equipment compared to the active divisions. They were spread thinly along the front, and critically, they were desperately short of modern anti-tank guns, which would prove fatal.
But the plan wasn't for them to stop the panzers cold, right? What was their role according to French doctrine?
Exactly. Their role, the purpose of those defenses, wasn't to hold indefinitely against a massive armored assault. It was to delay the enemy, to buy time. The doctrine called for them to hold out for perhaps 48, maybe 72 hours. Long enough for France's powerful mobile reserves, the armored and motorized divisions held back for precisely this purpose, to arrive on the scene, seal off any penetration, and launch powerful counterattacks.
So the entire French plan hinged on the speed and effectiveness of that counterattack.
It was absolutely everything. Delay at the river, then a swift, decisive counterpunch from the reserves. That was the theory.
So what happened on May 13th when Guderian arrived?
Guderian didn't waste any time. He immediately planned crossings for the afternoon. The assault was preceded by a massive aerial bombardment unlike anything seen before. Hundreds of German bombers, especially the Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers, relentlessly pounded the French positions along the Meuse.
This Stuka's acting as pinpoint artillery.
Precisely. They targeted bunkers, machine gun nests, artillery positions with terrifying accuracy and psychological impact. The noise, the destruction, it severely shook the morale of those reservist defenders. Then came the artillery barrage, followed by assault troops in inflatable rubber boats paddling across the Meuse under fire.
And it got across.
Yes. Despite taking casualties, elements of all three of Guderian's panzer divisions, 1st, 2nd, and 10th, managed to establish small breachheads on the south bank by the evening of May 13th. But, and this is crucial, this was just a breakthrough. It was a toehold. The bridgeheads were shallow, disorganized, vulnerable. The tanks themselves hadn't crossed in large numbers yet. Pontoon bridges were needed. The decisive moment wasn't the crossing itself. It was what happened next. It was the French response, or lack thereof, on May 14th.
Which brings us squarely to the French commander responsible for that response. General Jean Flavigny, commander of the 21st Corps. He had the reserves, right? He was the guy supposed to deliver that counterpunch.
He was the key. Flavigny had under his command exactly the forces designed for this job. The powerful 3rd Armored Division, 3E DCR, the 3rd Motorized Infantry Division, plus some independent tank battalions. Altogether, he had something like 300 modern tanks available, including many heavy Char B1s.
More than enough to crush those initial German bridgeheads.
On paper, absolutely. Guderian's bridgehead on the morning of May 14th was precarious. His troops were tired, disorganized after the assault crossing. The 1st and 2nd Panzer divisions, which had led the crossings, were running low on fuel and ammunition. The 10th Panzer was still getting elements across. The bridgehead itself was mostly held by the Panzer's own motorized infantry regiments, not masses of tanks yet. Flavigny had local numerical superiority, especially in heavy tanks, and much shorter supply lines. If he had launched a coordinated, powerful attack at dawn on May 14th,
he could have potentially destroyed Guderian's corps, or at least thrown them back into the Meuse.
it's highly likely. Guderian himself admitted later it was the moment he feared most. A determined French counterattack then could have completely changed the course of the battle, maybe the campaign.
So, why didn't it happen? What went wrong?
It's a cascade of failures, really, starting with command, control, and communications C2. Flavigny did plan a counterattack for the morning of the 14th, scheduled initially for around 5 a.m., but almost immediately, things started to unravel.
A logistical problem.
Yes. Reports came in of units not being in position, delays in getting fuel trucks forward to the tanks, problems coordinating the assembly areas for the different units involved. The attack time kept getting pushed back, first to 7 a.m., then later.
Frustrating, but maybe understandable in the fog of war.
Perhaps. But then as the morning wore on, something else kicked in. Panic and misinformation. French troops retreating from the Meuse line, badly shaken by the Stuka attacks and the German assault, started spreading wild rumors back through the rear areas.
Exaggerating the German strength.
Massively exaggerating. Reports flooded into Flavigny's headquarters, often via unreliable field telephones or runners, talking about huge numbers of German tanks pouring out of the bridgehead, about unstoppable breakthroughs. Remember, the French lacked good radio communication to get accurate reports from the front. Flavigny was operating partly blind, relying on panicked accounts.
And he bought into the panic.
It seems so. By early afternoon, having already postponed the attack multiple times, Flavigny seems to have convinced himself that he was facing an overwhelming German armored force and that launching his divisions into a counterattack would be suicidal, leading to their destruction. Fear of failure gripped him. Around 2 p.m. on May 14th, just as some elements were finally getting ready to move, he made the catastrophic decision. He canceled the coordinated counterattack altogether.
He has canceled it, when he arguably held the tactical advantage.
He canceled the main concerted thrust. It was a complete failure of nerve, a total collapse of initiative. His 3rd Armored Division alone probably outnumbered the German tanks that were actually operational on the South Bank at that moment, instead of striking decisively at the vulnerable German bridgehead.
What did he do with his powerful reserves then?
He frittered them away. He ordered his units, including the tanks of the 3rd Armored, to disperse defensively over a wide arc miles back from the Meuse, trying to form a new blocking line. This led to total command paralysis. Units got scattered, communications broke down completely. When he tried to vaguely organize some kind of attack again for May 15th, nobody really knew where their own units were, let alone the enemy's. Poor radio meant commanders were operating in the dark. The attack for the 15th was also called off. The critical 24-hour window, the moment Guderian dreaded, had slammed shut. It was lost.
And while Flavigny was paralyzed, what were the French focusing on? You mentioned the village of Stone earlier.
Yes, Stone. While the operational opportunity to smash the bridgehead was evaporating, Flavigny and his superior, General Charles Hunziker, the commander of the Second Army, became almost obsessed with retaking the small hilltop village of Stone, which German infantry and tanks had occupied early on May 14th, south of the main bridgehead.
Why Stone? What was so important about it?
Tactically, it controlled some high ground overlooking the southern flank of the German penetration, but the fixation on it seems to reveal a deeper flaw in French military thinking at the time.
Which was?
A preoccupation with ground, with specific geographical locations. French doctrine seemed to emphasize recapturing lost territory, like Stone, often before dealing with the enemy's main operational maneuver. They wanted to tidy up the map, retake the village, then think about the bigger picture.
And for Guderian, this focus on Stone.
It was an absolute gift. He needed time and space for his main force, the 1st and 2nd Panzer Divisions, to get fully across the Meuse, refuel, reorganize, and then break out westwards towards the Channel. The fierce battle for Stone which changed hands something like 17 times over the next few days.
That was in tune time.
Yes, brutal, close quarters fighting. Guderian happily left his 10th Panzer Division and the elite Grossdeutschland motorized infantry regiment to tie down significant French forces, including elements of Flavigny's precious armored reserves, in this bloody struggle for a single village. It was the perfect diversion. It bought Guderian the critical time and space he needed. The French were fighting fiercely over a tactical objective while the Germans were winning the operational battle, breaking out and heading west. The Sedan breach wasn't sealed by German strength. It was sealed by French paralysis and doctrinal misdirection.
It's easy to get focused solely on Sedan because it was Guderian's crossing point and the focus of Manstein's plan, but you mentioned other panzer divisions involved.
Absolutely. We have to remember, Army Group A, commanded by Rundstedt, had 7 panzer divisions in total for this dust. While Guderian's 3 were hitting Sedan, 4 others were crossing the Meuse further north, between about Heux and Dinant in Belgium.
Who was leading those crossings?
These included divisions commanded by General Max von Hartleib-Walsporn, 5th Panzer, and, perhaps most famously, General Erwin Rommel with his 7th Panzer Division.
Rommel. Okay. And did the French react better there?
The French 9th Army, defending that sector, fought very hard in places. The Belgian forces also resisted, but they suffered from the same systemic problems we saw at Sedan. Poor communication, lack of coordination between infantry and the few available tanks, reserves arriving too late or piecemeal, and again, the devastating psychological impact of relentless Stuka attacks to which they had little answer.
So the breakthroughs happened there too.
Yes. Rommel, in particular, embodied that Auftragstaktik spirit. He got elements of his 7th Panzer across the Meuse at Dinant relatively quickly and, crucially, didn't wait for the whole division to consolidate. He pushed forward almost immediately on the morning of May 14th, leading a small, improvised battle group deep into the French lines, often bypassing pockets of resistance just to maintain speed and momentum.
While Rommel is breaking out, the French do manage to launch a significant counterattack further south, don't they, near Flavien?
They do. This is the Battle of Flavien on May 15th, and it's incredibly important because it gives us a direct comparison. It pits the French 1st Armored Division, or DCR, against Hartleib's 5th Panzer Division. And on paper, the French should have had a significant edge.
Why? What did the French 1st Armored have?
They had around 170 tanks, including about 65 of those formidable Char B-1 BIS tanks. We know from accounts that the main German anti-tank gun at the time, the 37mm PaK-36, its shells often just bounced right off the thick armor of the Char B-1. It was nicknamed the door knocker by German troops because that's all it could do. The French also had excellent Samua S-35 tanks. Individually, tank for tank, the French had arguably superior hardware in this battle.
So why did the 1st Armored Division essentially get destroyed at Flavien?
It boils down to that difference between hardware and software, between the machines and the doctrine, and C2 used to employ them. The French tanks, powerful as they were, advanced relatively slowly, often in rigid lines, and critically they lacked effective radio communication between tanks. Commanders struggled to coordinate maneuvers or react quickly to changing threats.
Well,
The Germans, even with individually weaker tanks like the Panzer III and IV, used their radios constantly. Their officers could orchestrate complex, fluid maneuvers in real time. They'd probe, attack, withdraw, maneuver around the flanks, concentrating fire from multiple panzers onto isolated French tanks. They drew the heavier, slower French tanks out, separated them from their limited infantry support.
and picked them off one by one.
Exactly. They used wolf pack tactics, enabled by radio communication, and again, the Stukas played a vital role. The French 1st Armored had very little mobile anti-aircraft support traveling with it. The Stukas could operate almost with impunity, acting as flying artillery, diving down to bomb-specific French tanks or breakup formations directed by the German ground commanders. Flavien wasn't a failure of French tanks, it was a catastrophic failure of French combined arms doctrine and C2. It proved that tactical flexibility and coordination could overcome brute armor thickness.
So, with the French 1st Armored smashed at Flavien, the door was wide open for Rommel.
Wide open. Rommel just surged forward with his 7th Panzer Division. He pushed incredibly deep, incredibly fast, bypassing French units, sowing chaos and confusion in the rear areas. He covered something like 80 kilometers on one of those days. His division moved so fast that even German high command sometimes lost track of exactly where it was.
Earning the nickname Ghost Division.
The Gespenster Division, because he just seemed to appear out of nowhere deep behind enemy lines. The psychological impact on the French command structure, already reeling, was devastating. He scattered an entire French motorized infantry division, captured vital supply depots, seized bridges before they could be blown. His success wasn't just about speed, it was about the sustained speed of his entire combined arms formation.
And other divisions were doing similar things. You mentioned General Kemp.
Yes, General Werner Kemp, commanding the 6th Panzer Division, which crossed the Meuse slightly north of Sedan at Montfermeil. This crossing was initially held up by very determined French colonial troops, well-trained machine gunners. But then, incredibly, the French High Command ordered these troops to withdraw westwards, fearing they'd be cut off,
Leaving the crossing undefended.
essentially creating a gap. Kemp seized the opportunity instantly. Again, typical off-track tactic. He didn't wait for elaborate plans. He immediately threw together an improvised detachment, some tanks, some motorcycle troops, some engineers, some artillery, making sure they could all move together at speed.
And they pushed through fast.
Unbelievably fast. Sources mention one advance of 55 kilometers in just 5 hours. They moved so rapidly that they completely surprised the French 2nd Armored Division, 2E DCR, catching it while it was still trying to assemble and deploy into a defensive blocking position. The French tanks were literally refueling or moving on transporters when Kemp's spearhead hit them. Total chaos ensued.
So it's Guderian at Sedan, Rommel and Hartleib further north, Kemp exploiting the gap at Montfermeil. It's a multi-pronged breakout.
Exactly. It wasn't just one hole punched in the line, it was multiple breaches, all being exploited simultaneously by these fast-moving combined arms task forces. They had the doctrine, the C2 with radios, the aggressive leadership, and the sheer momentum to just keep pushing westwards, unhinging the entire French defensive system and denying the French command any chance to establish a coherent new line of defense. The speed itself became a weapon, paralyzing the French response. #tag6, culpability and the shifting narrative.
We've talked about Flavigny's failure at the tactical level, the failure to counterattack. But zooming out, who was responsible at the higher operational level for the Sedan sector? That brings us back to General Charles Hunsiker, right? Commander of the French Second Army.
Yes, Hunsiker's role is absolutely central to understanding the scale of the disaster, and his actions, or inactions, compounded every other failure. His command spanned the crucial Sedan sector.
And one of his biggest errors, according to the sources, was completely misreading the Germans' main objective.
He was utterly convinced, even as Guderian's panzers were pouring across the Meuse, that the main German threat wasn't the westward thrust towards the Channel, but rather a drive southwards, aimed at rolling up the flank of the main Maginot Line from behind, or isolating the eastern fortresses. He interpreted the Sedan attack as a large-scale diversion, not the main event.
Which meant he oriented his reserves and his thinking in the wrong direction.
Completely. His focus was south, while the real danger exploded westwards. And his decisions on May 15th, the day after Flavigny canceled his counterattack, were just fatal. Thinking he needed to consolidate his army against this phantom southern threat, Hunsiker ordered his divisions, including those near Sedan, to pull back and form a new defensive line further south.
But instead of consolidating,
he inadvertently did the exact opposite of what was needed. By pulling his units back, he dramatically widened the gap that Guderian and Kleist's panzer group were already exploiting. He essentially opened the door even wider for the German drive to the coast, making it virtually impossible for any other French forces to plug the breach. It was a catastrophic misjudgment based on a faulty premise.
And this pullback also had direct consequences for the Maginot Line itself, specifically that small fort, Ouvrage La Ferté.
Yes. La Ferté was a relatively small, isolated two-bunker fort, Petit Ouvrage, on the westernmost edge of the fortified line, falling under Hunsiker's command area. When Hunsiker ordered the general withdrawal on May 15th, La Ferté and its garrison of just over 100 men were left completely isolated, miles ahead of the new French line, surrounded by advancing German forces.
Why did the Germans bother attacking it? Was it a real threat?
Tactically, it posed a minor threat to the southern flank of their advance, but its real significance became symbolic and political. The Germans wanted to prove that the impregnable Maginot Line could be broken. Capturing a fort, even a small one, would be a huge propaganda victory. So, they decided to eliminate La Ferté.
And tell us what happened to the garrison. You touched on it earlier.
It's a truly tragic story. After Hunsiker's withdrawal order left them stranded, the French made some attempts to relieve the fort, but these failed, partly because the necessary reserves were still focused elsewhere or disorganized. The Germans then launched a determined assault on May 18th, focusing on one of the two main bunkers.
Using engineers.
Yes, German combat engineers got close under heavy covering fire and managed to place large explosive charges directly against the armored observation cupolas and weapon embrasures. The explosions breached the thick concrete and steel. They then tossed grenades inside.
Which started fires.
Exactly. Intense fires broke out within the confined space of the bunker, and crucially, La Ferté's ventilation system was apparently inadequate or damaged. Thick, acrid smoke rapidly filled the bunker and spread through the underground gallery connecting it to the other blockhouse.
Oh, God. So they weren't killed by the blast directly.
Most weren't. They were choking. The garrison commander, Lieutenant Bourguignon, desperately radioed his superiors requesting permission to surrender to save his men from asphyxiation.
And permission was
denied. In a final, horrifying display of doctrinal rigidity, perhaps the idea that Maginot forts must never surrender the request was refused. The entire garrison, 107 officers and men, succumbed to smoke inhalation during the night of May 18th, 19th. When the Germans finally entered the fort the next morning, they found no survivors. It was a grim, symbolic end, broadcast to the world as proof that the Great Wall had been breached and its defenders sacrificed.
It just underscores the human cost of these high-level failures. But looking at Hunziker again, the sources suggest this wasn't just a case of bad luck or battlefield confusion. He had warnings, didn't he?
He had multiple clear warnings that the Sedan sector was vulnerable. As early as March 1940, a French parliamentary commission inspected the defenses and reported back that they were alarmingly insufficient for the task. Hunziker apparently dismissed their concerns, called them alarmist civilians who didn't understand military matters.
And he famously said something about the Germans never attacking there.
Yes, according to some accounts, he stated quite confidently, "I do not believe the Germans will ever consider attacking in the region of Sedan." This flies in the face of French intelligence reports suggesting a possible Ardennes thrust, and incredibly, it ignored the results of a French military war game conducted back in 1938.
A war game showed this could happen.
Precisely. A 1938 command post exercise had simulated a German armored attack through the Ardennes targeting Sedan, and it had demonstrated that such an attack was feasible and extremely dangerous. Hunziker either ignored, forgot, or dismissed this crucial lesson from his own army's exercises.
And beyond ignoring warnings, there's evidence of just complacency during the phony war period.
Absolutely. The period from September 1939 to May 1940, the drôle de guerre, offered months to improve defenses, train troops, prepare. Yet sources indicate Hunziker showed a distinct lack of urgency. For example, he reportedly failed to requisition needed land from local farmers to create proper artillery practice ranges, meaning his gunners lacked adequate training. He allowed local routines to take precedence over urgent military preparations.
And assigning those Category B reserve divisions to the most critical sector.
That was a fateful decision. Assigning the older, less equipped, less trained 55th and 71st Divisions to hold the hinge point at Sedan, while sending better active divisions into Belgium, seems like a catastrophic misallocation of resources, driven perhaps by that flawed assumption about where the main attack would come. His army was also dangerously overstretched, trying to cover far too much frontage with the divisions he had.
Even when the attack began, the reports from reconnaissance planes.
Even when French reconnaissance aircraft spotted the massive German armored columns snaking through the Ardennes on May 11th and 12th, Hunziker seemingly clung to his preconceived notion. He interpreted it as a feint, a diversion, still believing the main effort must be coming elsewhere. It looks like a classic case of confirmation bias on a catastrophic scale. His complacency, his misjudgments, his dismissal of warnings, and his fatal delay in understanding the situation arguably made the disaster at Sedan and the subsequent collapse almost inevitable once the attack began. So after the war, how was this all explained? Who took the blame?
For a long time, the dominant narrative, especially in popular history and even some military circles, really focused on German military brilliance. You know, the genius of Guderian, the boldness of Manstein, the unstoppable panzers, the terrifying Stukas.
And that narrative was quite convenient, wasn't it? For German generals writing their memoirs after the war, it painted the Wehrmacht as this superb, professional, almost apolitical fighting machine. It helped rehabilitate their image.
And maybe for the French, too. Was it easier to accept defeat at the hands of supposed genius rather than confronting internal failure?
Possibly. Attributing the fall to some kind of unstoppable Blitzkrieg genius was perhaps less painful, less embarrassing for the French military and political establishment than admitting the sheer depth of their own strategic failures, doctrinal rigidity, C2 breakdowns, and leadership incompetence.
But more recent historical research, looking deeper into the archives, the operational records, it's challenged that German brilliance narrative, hasn't it?
Significantly, modern scholarship paints a much more nuanced picture. Volgeld wasn't some perfectly preordained, flawlessly executed masterpiece. It was a high-risk gamble, a sequence of calculated risks, brilliant improvisations, and crucially opportunities that were seized largely because the French response was so slow, so confused, so paralyzed.
So the focus shifts back to French failures.
Increasingly, yes. The blame now centers much more on the critical failures within the French command structure. Flavigny's catastrophic indecision at the crucial moment on May 14th, Gamelin's strategic fixation on the northern Belgium scenario, leaving the center weak, and perhaps most critically, Hunziker's string of misjudgments, his complacency, his dismissal of warnings, and his fatal operational orders that widened the gap. German daring succeeded largely because French leadership failed so profoundly.
Which brings us to the really uncomfortable questions about Hunziker's role, especially given what happened to him after the fall of France.
Indeed. Unlike many commanders associated with the defeat, Hunziker wasn't sidelined or scapegoated. He seems to have been protected by high-level political connections. Blame was often deflected onto others, like General Korapp, commander of the neighboring Ninth Army, which also collapsed. But Hunziker, he emerged relatively unscathed.
And he became a key figure in the Vichy regime.
A very key figure. He was one of the earliest and strongest advocates for seeking an armistice with Germany in June 1940. And quite incredibly, he was chosen as the lead signatory for France at the armistice ceremony in the railway carriage at Compiègne, the same carriage where Germany had signed the 1918 armistice. He then went on to hold significant power within the collaborationist Vichy government, serving as Minister of War and playing a role in the Riem trial, which sought to blame Republican politicians for the defeat.
That subsequent career path, it inevitably raises suspicions, doesn't it? Looking back at his actions in May 1940.
It casts a very long and troubling shadow. The historical debate remains intense. Was Hunziker simply incompetent? A man promoted beyond his abilities, blinded by outdated doctrine and wishful thinking, who crumbled under pressure? Or was there something more deliberate at play? Did his known right-wing, perhaps even pro-fascist, sympathies influence his actions? Did he, consciously or subconsciously, fail to act decisively in ways that ultimately facilitated the German victory he seemed politically amenable to? Was it incompetence, or was it bordering on treason?
Can we definitively answer that?
Probably not definitively, based on the available evidence. The records don't provide a smoking gun of deliberate betrayal. But what we can say is that France didn't fall solely because of one man's malice or mediocrity, even Hunziker's. He was perhaps the ultimate, most damaging symptom of a deeper, chronic sickness within the French political and military system of the Third Republic. A system that had failed to adapt, failed to modernize its thinking, its technology, its leadership structures after the immense trauma of the First World War. Hunziker's failures, catastrophic as they were, provided the final, fatal opening that the dynamic, risk-taking German doctrine was perfectly poised to exploit. #tag outro.
So wrapping this deep dive up, what's the big takeaway? What does this autopsy of Sedan tell us? It seems clear the collapse of France in 1940 was far from inevitable, far from just being about German genius.
No, it really looks like the devastating result of this chain reaction of failures on the French side. You had this cultural and doctrinal rigidity born directly from the horrific scars of World War I that prevented adaptation. You had the almost complete failure to integrate vital modern technology like radio for command and control, leaving them fighting a 1940 war with 1918 communication methods.
And then, at the critical moments, the catastrophic failure of leadership and initiative from key commanders, Flavigny freezing, Hunziker misjudging and compounding the errors, operating with what looks disturbingly like criminal negligence in some cases.
Exactly. The German tactical skill, the operational boldness, particularly from commanders like Guderian and Rommel, was undeniable. They executed their risky plan brilliantly in many ways, but we have to remember how fragile Guderian's bridgehead actually was on May 14th. It could have been crushed.
Which brings us back to that whole economic angle, the shark economy. The French strategy, however flawed in execution, was ultimately based on outlasting Germany financially, denying them the quick victory their precarious Mefo-Bill economy demanded.
That was the strategic logic. All depended on buying time.
Okay, so here's the final provocative thought we want to leave you with. Think about this. If the French command structure, just for a moment, hadn't failed, if General Flavigny had launched that counterattack with his 300 tanks on May 14th, as he could have, as perhaps he should have, even if it didn't completely destroy Guderian, could that attack, that delay, that disruption to the German timetable. Could it have been enough?
Enough to do what?
Enough to push the German war effort past that critical point. Could a delay of even a few more days or a week have allowed those MFO bills to start coming due back in Berlin, triggering the economic chaos the French were banking on? Could a single successful operational counterthrust at Sedan have potentially forced a German economic collapse, thereby saving France? It just reminds you, doesn't it, how often history seems to balance on these incredibly fine points on a single moment of initiative seized, or tragically, initiative lost. That lack of initiative at Sedan arguably changed the entire course of the 20th century.